What kind of person mocks a kid in front of a judge, without knowing he's the one holding all the cards? Karen laughed at my son in court, thinking he didn't stand a chance. But when she found out he's a lawyer who's never lost a case, that smile disappeared real fast. I still remember the day as if it were yesterday. The courthouse was buzzing with anticipation, the air heavy with the seriousness of legal proceedings. In a situation that seemed destined for hilarity at Karen's expense, she had taken it upon herself to publicly belittle my son, a young, bright-eyed attorney who had just stepped into his first big case. With a condescending sneer and an obvious belief that he was nothing more than a naive upstart, she mocked him in front of the judge and the assembled audience. Her words, dripping with arrogance, cut through the formal silence of the courtroom. She ridiculed his youthful demeanor, scoffing at his legal arguments before the trial had even truly begun. But the turning point was as swift as it was dramatic. As Karen continued her tirade, confident that she was winning a battle of words against an inexperienced adversary, whispers began to spread. People started murmuring that there was more to the young lawyer than met the eye. In that courtroom, where every word was scrutinized, Karen's smirk faltered the moment the judge inquired about his credentials. In a flash, it emerged that my son had not only graduated to the top of his class, but had built an impeccable record over the past few years, never losing a single case. In that moment, his quiet confidence and razor-sharp legal mind became impossible to ignore. The courtroom atmosphere shifted instantly. The laughter that had emanated from Karen's corner now fell silent. Her eyes widened and her tone faltered as she struggled to regain control of the situation. What had started as a display of condescension had turned into a public unraveling. The judge, noting the shift, reminded everyone that the courtroom was not a stage for petty insults, but a venue for justice. Karen's bravado crumbled, and the air thickened with the realization that the cards had suddenly changed, and not in her favor. That singular, charged moment set the tone for what was about to unfold. A battle not just of legal arguments, but of pride, reputation, and the very meaning of respect. It was a moment that underscored one thing. In a world where words carry as much weight as actions, sometimes the truth is the most devastating counterattack. Crescent Pines, our upscale gated community, was known for its picture-perfect lawns, uniform houses painted in soft hues, and an unwavering adherence to homeowners association (HOA) rules. Every detail, from the spacing of the hedges to the model of the mailbox, was regulated in the name of preserving communal harmony. In this carefully structured environment, conformity was prized over individuality, and those who dared to stray from the prescribed norm were often met with fines, scorn, or outright ridicule. At the center of this regimented order was Karen Miller, the self-appointed enforcer known by everyone as HOA Karen. In her early 50s, Karen maintained an air of unchallengeable authority. Dressed in immaculate business attire with her clipboard always clutched tightly in hand and a smartphone glued to her ear, she patrolled Crescent Pines with a sharp eye for any deviation from the rules. To Karen, every act of creative self-expression was a threat to the immaculate image of the community, a community where even the soft, vibrant hues of a child's drawing might be deemed a blot on perfection. My son, Jason, had grown up amid these rigid expectations, but had always possessed a spark of defiance. From an early age, he questioned why everything had to be so uniform and why rules had to be enforced with such an iron grip. Perhaps it was this natural curiosity and disdain for unnecessary constraints that led him to pursue a career in law. Now a young attorney with an unblemished record, Jason was the embodiment of tenacity and intellect, a stark contrast to the overbearing rigidity of the HOA. I had always prided myself on raising him to think for himself and to stand up for what was right. Our family values were rooted in the belief that individual freedom and creativity were essential to a fulfilling life. So, when Jason entered the courtroom, I knew he was not simply another face in a crowd of obedient residents. He was a fighter, one who believed in justice not as a static concept, but as a living, breathing principle that must be defended at all costs. Crescent Pines, with its manicured lawns and regulated facades, was as much a character in our story as any of its residents. While many followed the HOA's instructions to the letter, a quiet undercurrent of resistance whispered through the neighborhood. Neighbors would exchange knowing glances when Karen launched one of her campaigns against nonconformity. In that world of enforced sameness, Jason's individuality shone like a beacon, quiet, resilient, and destined to challenge the status quo. The courtroom, where the dramatic confrontation would soon unfold, was a solemn space of justice, a venue where every word was weighed, every argument scrutinized. It was here that the clash of values, Karen's strict adherence to arbitrary rules versus Jason's passion for justice, would be laid bare, setting the stage for a showdown that would redefine respect and accountability in Crescent Pines. The conflict began on a day that could have been ordinary. The case at hand involved a minor dispute over a property disagreement that I had been involved in for some time. Jason, representing my interests, was tasked with defending our side in what the HOA had branded as a trivial infraction, a case that, on paper, should have been easily dismissed. But Karen, with her habitual disdain for any form of nonconformity, saw this as an opportunity to assert her dominance in the courtroom. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed with residents, local officials, and a few curious onlookers. Karen had taken a position of superiority from the outset. With a tone dripping in condescension, she derided Jason's arguments in front of the judge, laughing off his points as if they were the naive musings of an inexperienced child. "Is that all you've got?" she scoffed, her voice echoing mockingly in the sterile chamber. It was a display meant to humiliate, designed to reinforce the idea that adherence to the HOA's strict rules was paramount, and that anyone who dared defy them was doomed to fail. Jason listened intently, his face a study in calm determination. He had prepared meticulously, armed not just with legal precedents, but with a quiet, unwavering confidence that came from years of hard work and unbroken discipline. His arguments were measured, thoughtful, and, as it later emerged, unassailable, each point systematically debunking Karen's baseless assertions. Every rebuttal he offered was a reminder that justice was not a matter of opinion, but of fact, logic, and the unyielding rule of law. As the proceedings unfolded, murmurs began to ripple through the courtroom. Whispers turned into low conversations among the residents, many of whom had witnessed Karen's domineering behavior firsthand over the years. Soon, it became evident that people were beginning to question her credibility. In hushed tones, observers noted that while Karen appeared to be the arbiter of community standards outside the courtroom, inside, the balance of power was shifting in Jason's favor. Then came the moment that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. In response to one of Karen's particularly scornful jibes, the judge asked her to elaborate on her understanding of the legal principles at stake. It was then that the truth began to emerge. Jason's record was impeccable. He had never lost a case in his burgeoning legal career. A ripple of realization spread through the room like wildfire. The young attorney who had been ridiculed moments before was, in fact, a formidable force who had consistently defended the rights of individuals against arbitrary impositions. Karen's smirk faltered imperceptibly at first, then vanished entirely, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably. What had begun as an exercise in humiliation for my son had turned into a public unraveling of Karen's authority. His calm, measured responses, underpinned by solid legal precedents and supported by his impeccable track record, began to tip the scales. Her carefully constructed facade of superiority was crumbling, and the once confident tone in her voice was now laced with uncertainty. Emboldened by the turning tide, Jason pressed on, highlighting case after case where similar arbitrary fines had been thrown out and pointing to statutory protections for homeowners and residents. Every argument he made was met with silent nods of approval from the audience, and even the judge's questions grew more pointed, seeking clarity and accountability from Karen's side. The board members and several local officials present couldn't help but exchange skeptical glances as they absorbed the weight of his legal arguments. Outside the courtroom, The digital narrative was forming simultaneously. Social media exploded with live updates and clips from the hearing. Hashtags such as hashtag Justice for Jason, hashtag No More Karen, and hashtag Legal Victory trended in our community. Neighbors posted supportive messages, and a few even cited their own experiences of being bullied by the HOA. The collective sentiment was clear. The days of arbitrary enforcement and public humiliation were coming to an end. By the end of the session, it was evident that Karen's misguided mockery had backfired spectacularly. Every word Jason spoke chipped away at her authority, and the public's reaction was overwhelmingly in his favor. The conflict was no longer merely a courtroom drama. It had evolved into a broader battle for the respect of individual rights against an overzealous enforcer. And as the proceedings drew to a close, the seeds of a much larger movement, one that championed fairness and accountability, had been firmly planted. In the days following that fateful courtroom session, the story of the young attorney's triumphant defense spread rapidly throughout Crescent Pines. Social media platforms lit up with clips of Jason's closing argument and candid shots capturing the moment when Karen's smirk dissolved into shock. Hashtags like hashtag Legal Victory, hashtag No More Karen, and hashtag Justice for Jason trended locally, galvanizing residents who had long endured the HOA's oppressive grip. Local news outlets soon picked up the story, turning what had started as a minor neighborhood dispute into a headline-grabbing controversy. Reporters flocked to Crescent Pines, interviewing neighbors who recalled previous instances of Karen's condescending behavior and praising Jason's resolve. It's inspiring to see someone stand up not only for themselves, but for the right of every resident to be treated with respect, one local anchor remarked during a live broadcast. The narrative was clear. In a community where conformity was enforced by outdated rules and cruel mockery, a fresh voice of reason had emerged. Inside the courthouse, murmurs of disbelief and admiration echoed long after the session ended. Many residents who had once been intimidated by Karen's relentless fines now began questioning the very basis of her authority. Digital petitions demanding an overhaul of HOA policies proliferated, and community forums buzzed with impassioned discussions about fairness, respect, and the need for transparency in local governance. Every shared video clip of Jason's articulate defense and every comment praising his flawless record only served to intensify the collective call for reform. The HOA board, once a fortress of unchallenged authority, began to fracture under the weight of public scrutiny. Behind closed doors, board members argued heatedly. Some staunchly defended Karen's insistence on strict adherence to community rules, claiming that any deviation would lead to chaos. Others, swayed by the incontrovertible digital evidence and the resounding support for Jason, argued that the board had long prioritized aesthetic conformity over the genuine needs and rights of its residents. One board member, in a leaked conversation, remarked, "We must reconsider whether enforcing these arbitrary standards is worth the cost to our community's spirit." The internal discord set the stage for a dramatic showdown, a final public hearing that promised to redefine the power dynamics in Crescent Pines. As the final hearing neared, I continued to document every development and encouraged residents to attend. My online updates were punctuated with detailed explanations of legal precedents, examples of other communities that had successfully reformed their HOA practices, and heartfelt testimonials from neighbors who had been personally affected by Karen's overreach. The digital petition I started quickly surpassed tens of thousands of signatures, and it became clear that the momentum of our movement was unstoppable. Karen, for her part, was visibly shaken by the swift tide of public opinion. Her attempts to publicly justify her behavior, releasing video statements in which she claimed she had acted in the best interests of the community, were met with biting criticism online and in local media. Every time she appeared on a local news segment, the camera would catch the momentary loss of her self-assured smile, replaced by uncertainty and, at times, quiet desperation. On the morning of the final public hearing, Crescent Pines was buzzing with anticipation. Residents gathered in large numbers at the community center, many carrying handmade signs and wearing T-shirts emblazoned with messages of support for Jason and a call for reform. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of hope, defiance, and a collective demand for a fair and just approach to local governance. Digital cameras, smartphones, and even local news crews were present, ensuring that every detail of the showdown would be documented for posterity. Inside the boardroom, the tension was almost tangible. The HOA board members sat with anxious expressions, aware that the outcome of the hearing would not only affect Karen's future, but also set the tone for the community for years to come. My digital dossier, comprising security footage, legal documentation, and testimonials, was presented on a large screen, and it formed the backbone of a passionate, methodical argument for reform. As the hearing progressed, every argument and every piece of evidence reinforced the singular truth. In Crescent Pines, the rights of the residents were not to be sacrificed on the altar of arbitrary rule enforcement. The digital evidence had turned the tide, revealing a pattern of behavior by Karen that was unacceptable and establishing Jason's defense as a beacon of rationality and fairness. The energy in the room swelled with every nod of agreement from the audience, every supportive cheer from a neighbor who had suffered in silence for too long. By the time the final votes were cast, it was clear that the community was united. The HOA board was compelled to acknowledge the need for sweeping reforms that would protect individual rights and creativity. A detailed new policy proposal was soon drafted, one that would prevent any enforcer from wielding power based on personal vendettas rather than genuine concern for public welfare. The decisive moment arrived on a cool, crisp morning in a packed boardroom at the Crescent Pines Community Center. The room was alive with an air of anticipation as HOA officials, local law enforcement representatives, community leaders, and an impassioned assembly of residents gathered for the final public hearing. With a calm yet resolute demeanor, Councilwoman Emily Richards stepped up to the podium, her eyes blazing with the collective determination of a community that had had enough. After a thorough review of all digital evidence, including time-stamped security footage, detailed logs of fines, and the heartfelt testimonies of our residents, we have reached an inescapable conclusion. Councilwoman Richards began, her voice steady and authoritative. It is abundantly clear that the actions taken by Mrs. Karen Miller in mocking a young attorney, actions that were not only devoid of any genuine legal basis, but were driven by personal bias, represent a gross abuse of power. Our community's rights, and the right to be treated with respect regardless of age or experience, demand that we confront such behavior head-on. A heavy silence fell over the room as Richards continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind all fines and sanctions related to this incident. Moreover, we will institute a full disciplinary review of the practices that allowed such public mockery to occur, and we will implement new guidelines that guarantee the protection of every resident's dignity and rights. Today's decision is not simply about reversing an unjust fine. It is a resounding declaration that in Crescent Pines, every individual is entitled to be heard and respected, regardless of their background. Her words resonated powerfully, and murmurs of approval spread like wildfire through the audience. At that moment, a respected community advocate, a longtime champion of personal freedom and fairness, rose to speak. "Today, we stand united as one," he declared, his voice filled with passion and resolve. No resident, especially not a young lawyer who has dedicated his life to justice, should have to endure the scorn of arbitrary rule enforcement. Let this vote mark the turning point where we say that our community values talent, hard work, and fairness above petty prejudice. We demand accountability, and we will not rest until every misuse of power is met with swift, decisive action. His declaration was met with thunderous applause, uniting everyone in a collective call for reform. Following his address, a senior officer from the local legal oversight office presented a meticulously compiled dossier that included digital evidence, official records, and independent legal analyses demonstrating that my son's record was impeccable. He had never lost a case. The evidence left no room for doubt. The fines and Karen's mockery were nothing more than an abuse of power. The Internal Affairs panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures against any enforcer found to have acted out of personal bias, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release. Councilwoman Richards concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Crescent Pines, a community where every resident's rights are protected and where personal bias has no place in public governance. Our vote today is a resounding statement that we will uphold the dignity and respect of every individual. Together, we stand for justice, accountability, and the right for every voice to be heard." Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our battle for fairness and respect. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with hope and determination, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of the community forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever reshape the governance of Crescent Pines. The era of arbitrary fines and public mockery was over, replaced by a promise to protect the rights and dignity of all. In the weeks following the historic vote, Crescent Pines experienced a profound transformation. News of the rescinded fines and the sweeping reforms implemented by the HOA board spread rapidly throughout local media and social networks, igniting fervent discussions about dignity, property rights, and the value of respect. Editorials in the local newspaper, with headlines such as "A New Dawn for Crescent Pines" and "Community United for Justice," celebrated the decisive actions that have been taken to protect every resident's right to be treated fairly. Hashtags like #NoMoreKaren, #JusticeForAll, and #RespectOurVoice trended widely, reinforcing the community's newfound commitment to accountability. Town hall meetings and community forums saw record attendance as residents gathered to share their own stories of past grievances and envision a future where everyone was treated with the respect they deserved. Neighbors, who had once been cowed by arbitrary fines and public mockery, now spoke openly about their right to live without fear of punitive enforcement. Our community should be a sanctuary of respect and fairness, not a battleground for personal vendettas, one impassioned resident declared at a vibrant meeting, his words resonating throughout the packed room. The atmosphere was one of hope and renewal, a promise that Crescent Pines would always honor the dignity of its residents. Within the reformed HOA board and local oversight bodies, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, initiated comprehensive training programs on ethical conduct, conflict resolution, and the responsible management of community affairs. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary processes were established to ensure that every complaint was handled impartially. Our duty is to protect the rights and dignity of every member of this community, Lieutenant Reed affirmed during a follow-up press conference, cementing the renewed commitment to justice and integrity. Community leaders and local civil rights organizations mobilized to further empower residents. Workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns were organized to raise awareness about the importance of treating every individual with respect and to encourage active community participation in local governance. When we come together, our collective voice can reshape even the most entrenched systems. A community activist proclaimed at a town hall, inspiring neighbors to unite in the fight for a more equitable future. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both deeply personal and profoundly transformative. My decision to stand up against Karen's derision and to defend my son's dignity had not only reclaimed a measure of respect, but had also ignited a movement that resonated throughout Crescent Pines. The digital evidence that exposed the injustice, every video clip, every supportive comment, became a rallying cry for every resident who believed that integrity and fairness should prevail over personal bias. Karen Miller, once the feared enforcer of arbitrary rules, was now reduced to a cautionary tale, a vivid reminder that no one is above accountability when a community unites for justice. As digital records of her past transgressions circulated widely, her influence waned, underscoring the urgent need for reform in Crescent Pines. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Crescent Pines, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered beneath the soft glow of the setting sun. A large banner reading, "Unity, Respect, and Justice" was unfurled between towering oaks, and heartfelt speeches echoed with promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate not just a victory in court, but the triumph of integrity and respect over arrogance and unchecked power, Councilwoman Richards proclaimed, her voice strong and inspiring. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our collective commitment to protect our rights and uphold the dignity of every resident. As each new day dawned over Crescent Pines, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of hope and progress. The story of how HOA Karen mocked my son in court, only to be exposed as overreaching when she discovered he was an undefeated lawyer, became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the power of truth and dignity. Every sunrise now carried with it the promise that in Crescent Pines, justice and respect would forever prevail. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to safeguard our rights against any form of arbitrary interference. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Crescent Pines would always be a place where truth, justice, and dignity shone brightly.